So choosing contrary to the good, the church recognizes two different categories of sin, right? We've got venial sin and we have mortal sin. And as we later in this episode, we're going to talk about like the logistics of making a confession, right? Like confessing your sins itself and what's necessary. But a piece of that is recognizing that there's a difference between these two things. So what is mortal sin? What is venial sin? What is the effect of each of these?
Yeah. Mortal sin is anything that's grave matter. So it's got to be something that's very serious.
What is grave matter?
Yeah, grave matter is the really serious stuff. Look at the Ten Commandments, and you're going to see the general headings for grave matter in the Ten Commandments. And so grave matter is worshiping idols, turning away from God. Grave matter is taking God's name in vain. Grave matter is dishonoring father and mother. Grave matter is adultery. Grave matter is murder. Grave matter is theft. Grave matter even is envy in different functions, in different ways, right? So broad strokes, we see grave matter. These are the really serious things. So a mortal sin is something that violates those precepts, that takes something that is very serious, and rather than doing what is good, choosing what is good, an individual chooses what is bad, what is evil, what is contrary to that good, and does so again on an issue or in a context that is extremely serious. That's really important.
Yeah.
So in order for a sin to be a mortal sin, it's got to be grave matter. It's got to be known that this thing is very serious, and to do this thing, to behave in this way is sinful, and I have to be free to choose to do it. I can't be coerced. If somebody has forced me to do something that I know is wrong, but I've been forced, there might be let's say the lack of virtue of courage in my heart. Like I might be missing some element of virtue, but I'm not guilty necessarily of the mortal sin because I was coerced into doing something.
Right.
If I have a sleepwalking disorder, and when I sleepwalk, I also break into cars and steal the car radio. It's grave matter to break into a car and steal a car radio. Nobody does that anymore. That used to be a common crime. Like you had to worry about. It's not a thing anymore. Anyway, it would be grave matter. It's serious. But if I'm sleepwalking and I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not guilty of the grave thing. On the other hand, if I know that this thing is wrong and I choose to do it anyway, I know that it is wrong to abuse alcohol. And I say to myself, you know what? I'm going to get ripped today. And I go out and I just down all the liquor in the liquor cabinet. Then that's grave matter. I know full well that it's wrong.
Right.
And I choose freely to do the thing that I know is wrong. So understanding that's kind of the context. Then you have venial sin. Venial sin are those sins that are, they're still imperfections. They're still things that are wrong, but they're not at the same level. They're not as serious. And the reality is that we do this in our criminal law. We have an understanding that there are certain things that are violations of the law, but there's ways that violation is more serious or less serious. So there's a difference between a felony and a misdemeanor. We understand that somebody who jaywalks is not as guilty of a crime as a serial killer, right? The crime of being a serial murderer is much more significant than jaywalking. Even something like, breaking the speed limit or violating some traffic law is, even though like life could be at stake, if you speed, there's a difference between, I drove 5 miles over the speed limit and got a ticket for it versus I drove 80 miles over the speed limit and got a ticket for it.
Right.
Different ways of doing the same thing. So the same crime, violating the speed limit, has two very different levels of severity. And so venial sin is that acknowledgement that there are some things that it's not right to do that, but you know what, maybe it's not as serious. So either the thing that you did isn't as significant, or it was done without thinking. It was done without sufficient reflection. It was done without even fully wanting to do the thing. I stubbed my toe, and upon stubbing my toe, an expletive left my mouth. because of the pain that I was in. I did not sit
Right.
down and think, I wonder how many different ways I can swear, how many different
Right.
forms of bad language I can employ in this context. And then I planned ahead, stubbed my toe, and then let fly with all these terrible words. No.
Let fly.
Yeah. What this does is it allows us to recognize that I might be a sinner. Yeah, that's true. I am imperfect. These are my imperfections. These imperfections are smaller. I still should work on them, but they're smaller. But this imperfection, this is the mortal one. This is the one that's really destroying me.
Right.
And this is where we can start getting into the effective sin. Like the effective mortal sin is that I separate myself from God. And I think that's always the important thing for us to emphasize when we talk about what sin does, because sin is always what I am doing contrary to God. God's move in this, and this is like such an important emphasis that we really have to give. And I don't think we've always done a great job of emphasizing this, but God's desire is always to come towards his people. Contrary to the ancient pagan gods that were looking for an excuse to smite their people, God is always looking to draw close to his people. God's not looking for the different ways to destroy us. He's not trying to destroy everything about us. Rather, he wants us to be in right relationship with him. But when I sin, what I'm doing is saying, no, thanks, God. I don't want that. I'm going to do my own thing. And then I'm pushing myself away. I'm moving myself away from that goodness of God, that love of God, that creative generosity of God. So sin is always a me moving away from God and never a God moving away from me. With mortal sin, because the thing that I have done is so serious, is of such grave matter, what I have done is it's essentially I've turned my back on God completely. I've broken my relationship by my own free choice, and I've created a rupture that is strong and that is very real. And so I'm distancing myself from God. With a venial sin, those lesser sins, those smaller sins, it's more like there's a small dent or a scratch in the bumper, right? There's a blemish now on the relationship, and I'm going to need to try to buff that out. I'm going to need to do something to fix that. So the effect of venial sin is it weakens my relationship, but it doesn't destroy it completely.
Yeah. So, some helpful imagery that I connect this idea to vice and virtue, which is, if you put it in an image, it's that vice is moving further from God. Like, vice and virtue are habits. And so you grow in the habit of virtue or the habit of vice. And what that means is you're just choosing something that, if you have the habit of vice, you're just choosing something that leads you further and further and further from God over and over and over and over. And you're making that choice freely every time, but it is easier to make that choice the further you get from God, which makes sense, right? Like, if within this image, if the goal is to cross the finish line and at the beginning of the race you're 100 meters away, but because you've made some bad decisions, all of a sudden you're 1,000 meters away, well, you might be tempted to think that the finish line is out of reach. And so, that's what vice does. Vice moves you backwards, whereas virtue moves you forward. You know, and so venial, it's almost like this is where the analogy stretches, I think. Too far, that is. It doesn't work, which is that a venial sin would move you further from that finish line, and it's harder to complete the race, whereas a mortal sin would kind of remove you from the race. But the thing is that you can always go to confession, so you can always join the race again. It doesn't work perfectly because you're never out of the race.
Oh,
so long as you are living and breathing.
Okay.
You know what I mean? You're in the race. And thanks for watching today's video. Let us know what you thought down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.